Whether you just got your first camera or you're curious to learn more about photography, or you've been taking photos all your life, this video will teach you some basic camera settings and shortcuts that I've learned throughout my career as a photographer. So it's good to learn these camera settings so that you know what to change when. The 3 camera settings that I'm going to be covering in this video: number 1 is shutter speed, number 2 is aperture, and number 3 is ISO. Don't let these words confuse you. Write them down or put a mental note in, and we'll cover one at a time, and I'm going to explain each one to you. Before I get into the camera settings, I want you to slide it out of the auto setting, and you'll want to go to the M or manual setting, and we'll be in that mode for the remainder of the video. Each of these 3 settings, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, all do the exact same thing, but for different reasons, and they affect your camera, your photos, and your videos all in a different way. My disclaimer whenever I teach people about cameras: when you are taking photos or videos of anything, it's always on a situation basis. The reason I say that these 3 camera settings are kind of the same and work the same way in your camera: either they'll make your photos brighter or they'll make them darker. We call that exposure. And if your photos get brighter, they'll be overexposed. If they get too dark, they'll be underexposed. The camera I'm using is a Sony A7C for the explanation in this video. So how I adjust shutter speed is through this back dial. I adjust aperture through this bottom dial, and then I adjust ISO by pressing right where it says ISO, and then on my LCD screen it'll pop up that ISO menu, and I use the same scroll wheel as aperture. Depending on which camera you have and will use for taking photos is all dependent on where your shutter speed and adjusting all these settings will be at. How shutter speed works is it is the length of time that your shutter is open and shows your sensor for the photo. You'll see a number that says normally like 1 over another number, and that is your shutter speed. The longer that your sensor is open or your shutter to take a picture, the more light that's coming in. 1/1000th of a second is a way faster shutter, and that'll make your image darker because it's letting less light in. If you bump your shutter down to like 1/10 or even open for a full second, your shutter is open, it's letting way more light into your sensor, therefore making your photos brighter. Not only does shutter speed affect your exposure for your photos, but it also affects motion blur. If you don't want blurry or unfocused images, then normally you would want your shutter speed kind of high. Situationally, for sports, wildlife, and a couple other situations, taking pictures of fast moving subjects, you want your shutter speed at a higher number so that it's able to freeze that frame and get you a nice sharp image. A shortcut that I found is that if you're in lower light situations and you have to bump down your shutter speed for whatever reason, is that whatever your focal length on your lens is, the biggest focal length, so if you're using a 70-200 lens, you want to not let your shutter speed drop under 1/200. If you're shooting at lower shutter speeds, it's not recommended to shoot handheld. So what I mean by that is that if you're shooting long exposure photography, star photography, like night photography, you want to have a good tripod, you want to have a good base for taking pictures, because if you move your camera while your sensor is open taking a picture, then your image will come out blurry as well. If you have any questions about shutter speed, definitely do not hesitate to ask me in the comments below, and try and help out each and every single one of you to become better photographers. let's talk about aperture. You might hear aperture referred to as a couple different things. Some people refer to aperture as an f-stop, aperture, how slow or fast a lens is. All that is just talking about the same thing. So for example, on this 20mm lens I have in front of me, my f-stop or my fast aperture is f/1.8. There's three things when it comes to aperture you want to remember. The higher your f-stop number goes, the darker your image will get. And the same thing, if your f-stop number goes lower, the lower that number goes, the brighter your image will get. The second thing for aperture is that the lower your number goes, the brighter your image gets. Your f-stop is the equivalent of you getting that blurry background, or the fancy photographer word is called bokeh. So if you want that, it gets you that nice, blurry, subject separated from the background look. So if I'm a good arm's length away, farther than arm's length away from my background, then that's pretty good separation. If I can get even farther and get even more, then that f/1.8 will come in handy and it'll make it more blurry back there. If you're taking pictures of mountains or your entire extended family, you want to make sure that everyone is in focus in the picture. So if you're taking pictures of your extended family, if you're here with your f/1.8 lens and you are focused on your front row of family members, everyone that's in front of and behind those family members will be out of focus. So for that exact situation, I would stick to like an f/4 or an f/5 to get everyone in focus and nice and sharp for the photos. Third thing I want to touch on with aperture is that when people refer to fast or slow glass, they would refer to something like this, a 20mm f/1.8, as fast glass, but that comes with like a caveat because typically in the camera community, fast glass means a lot more expensive and way more money. I'll have all the links below of all my camera gear that I use for my photos, and you're more than welcome to check it out. It's just all down in the description. The last setting that we have to talk about today is ISO. It's kind of backwards from the other two. So the higher number of ISO, the brighter your image will get, but the lower number of ISO, the darker your image will get. So it's backwards from aperture and shutter speed. What ISO does is it self-projects light onto your sensor in your camera to quote unquote produce fake light. If you get into a really high ISO number, your photos might come out more grainy and more kind of looking. It's basically how to explain it, is that they'll kind of look like ugh. My recommendation is just to keep that ISO number low, but in certain situations, you might have to go a little high. More than likely, if you buy a higher end DSLR or mirrorless camera, that's part of what you're paying for, is to get better ISO noise. So if I'm at an ISO level of 6400 on this camera, it'll be a better photo than if I was on ISO 6400 on this camera. Same shutter speed, same aperture, same ISO. The image that comes out of this camera, because it's more expensive, it's a different sensor, a couple other different things, but it would be an overall better photo. And that's part of what you pay for. Another way people refer to it in the photography community is that they call this the exposure triangle. After learning about ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, do you have any questions for me? Ask them in the comments below. I would love to help out. I hope you learned some settings that you could maybe use more to your advantage for your camera. And the best advice that I could give to you is just go out and take more photos. Learn your camera backwards, forwards, sideways, upside down, as much as you can, because the more you learn about your camera, the more better photos will come from it. I just enjoy taking better photos, and I want to help you do that too. So subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Let me know what your favorite part was, and I'll see you guys in the next one.